March 15th, 44 BC. The Curia of Pompey, Rome. The air is thick, not with incense, but with the cloying smell of human sweat, and a tension so palpable it feels like a physical weight pressing down on the chest. The sounds of the city, the distant rumble of carts, and the murmur of the forum are muffled and dreamlike, filtering through the high windows of the Senate House. Here, inside, the only sound is the rustle of woolen togas and a low, conspiratorial hum, the sound of 100 anxieties converging. Light streams in dusty shafts, illuminating the faces of men, some pale with resolve, others slick with the sheen of fear. For one man, Gaius Julius Caesar, the world is reduced to a series of sharp, disconnected sensations. First, the false warmth in the greeting of Tullius Cimber, his hand grasping Caesar's toga in a gesture that is slightly too firm, slightly too long. Then, a sudden, shocking cold. Not the chill of the marble floor, but a sliver of ice that pierces the fabric of his toga just below the neck. It is not a grand, heroic blow, but a clumsy, almost pathetic stab. For a heartbeat, there is only confusion, a neurological delay before the pain registers. Then another jolt from behind, sharper this time, and another. The world erupts into a cacophony of grunts, of shuffling feet, of tearing cloth. The air, once merely tense, is now filled with the metallic, coppery scent of fresh blood, his blood. He sees faces he knows, men he has pardoned, men he has promoted. He sees Marcus Brutus, his protege, his friend, dagger in hand, face a mask of tormented righteousness. The words, if he speaks them, are not a roar of defiance, but a choked whisper of betrayal. The light from the windows begins to dim. The sounds dissolve into a dull roar, and his last sensation is the hard, unforgiving cold of the floor as he falls at the feet of a great marble statue, the statue of his vanquished rival, Pompey the Great. This was the end of the man, but it was the true beginning of the myth. This is the narrative of him, the dictator who was murdered to save the Republic, and whose death ensured that the Republic would never live again. To understand how a man could die and yet become an eternal symbol of power, how a Roman aristocrat with no crown could bequeath his very name to the idea of absolute rule, we must ask the core question: how? This is the saga of Gaius Julius Caesar, and to understand this man, we must first return to the world that spawned him, a world that called itself a republic, but was, in truth, an empire in the throes of a violent and protracted death. The Roman eagle cast a long shadow across the known world, from the sun-scorched plains of Hispania to the ancient, opulent kingdoms of Asia Minor. But the heart of this empire, Rome itself, was deeply diseased. Imagine a city of 1 million souls, a sprawling metropolis of staggering wealth and abject poverty, where politics was no longer a matter of debate in the Senate, but of street warfare waged by the private gangs of ambitious aristocrats like Clodius Pulcher and Milo. The Republic, designed for a small city-state, was now cracking under the immense strain of governing hundreds of cultures and millions of people. In the vast agricultural estates of Sicily and southern Italy, the latifundia, armies of slaves, captured in Rome's endless wars, periodically rose up in bloody rebellion, most famously under the gladiator Spartacus, a revolt that took years and 8 legions to crush, leaving a scar of fear on the Roman psyche. To the east, the brilliant and implacable King Mithridates of Pontus had, for decades, waged a relentless war against Roman dominion, orchestrating the massacre of tens of thousands of Roman citizens in a single day and challenging the very notion of Roman invincibility. This was the macro-level chessboard, a global superpower suffering from imperial overstretch, its military machine constantly engaged on multiple fronts, while its political core rotted from within. The Senate, a body of fabulously wealthy landowners, was paralyzed by its own corruption and factionalism, unable to solve the fundamental problems of the age. The dispossession of small farmers who flocked to the city to become a volatile urban mob, the boundless ambition of generals who commanded personal loyalty from their legions, and the question of how to distribute the immense wealth of empire without tearing the state apart. It was a world desperately crying out for a solution, for a man who could impose order on the chaos. The tragedy was that the only solution the age could offer was autocracy, and the man who would ultimately provide it was born into a family that embodied the Republic's own contradictions. Ancient, proud, and teetering on the edge of irrelevance. To understand the man who would bring down the Republic, we must look to the house that bore him, the gens Julia. They were patricians of the highest order, tracing their lineage back to the goddess Venus herself, a divine ancestry that instilled in the young Gaius Julius an unshakable sense of destiny and superiority. Yet, this divine blood was thin currency in the brutal politics of the late Republic. The Julii were an old family, but a poor and politically marginal one. They had not produced a consul in generations. They possessed the name, but not the auctoritas, or the immense wealth that powered the Roman political machine. This was Caesar's ancestral curse, the burden of a divine legacy without the means to fulfill it. His character was forged in the crucible of this contradiction and in the shadow of two towering figures who defined his youth. The first was his uncle by marriage, Gaius Marius, a new man who had risen from obscurity to save Rome from Germanic invasions, a military genius who fundamentally reformed the army, making it loyal not to the state, but to its general. From Marius, Caesar inherited a connection to the populares, the political faction that championed the cause of the people against the senatorial elite, the optimates. But Marius also represented a terrifying precedent, a man who had used his military power to dominate the state. The second, and more terrifying figure, was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. After Marius's death, Sulla marched his own legions on Rome, seized power, and declared himself dictator, unleashing the proscriptions, a legalized campaign of murder against his political enemies. The young Caesar, as Marius's nephew, was a prime target. He was hunted, stripped of his inheritance and his priesthood, and forced into hiding. When Sulla demanded he divorce his wife, Cornelia, whose family was allied with Marius, Caesar committed his first great act of defiance. He refused. It was an astonishingly brave or foolhardy act for a teenager facing a ruthless dictator. Sulla, seeing both the stubborn pride and the dangerous ambition in the boy, is said to have relented, remarking to his lieutenants that he saw many a Marius in that young man. This experience of terror, loss, and defiance was the forge of his soul. It taught him that law was meaningless in the face of force, that tradition was a shield for the weak, and that survival and ultimate victory belonged to the audacious. It instilled in him a gambler's instinct and a profound understanding that in the great game of Roman politics, the ultimate prize was not just office, but survival itself. The first true glimpse of the man Caesar would become appeared not in the marbled halls of the Roman Forum, but in the turbulent waters of the Aegean Sea. After Sulla's reign of terror subsided, Caesar, still a young man, traveled east to begin his military service, the traditional path for any ambitious Roman noble. It was during the siege of Mytilene that he earned the Corona Civica, the Roman equivalent of the Victoria Cross, for saving the life of a fellow soldier. It was a mark of conventional Roman valor, a sign that he was a capable and brave officer. but it was the journey that followed which truly revealed the core of his being. While sailing to Rhodes to study rhetoric, his ship was captured by Cilician pirates, a plague upon the Mediterranean sea lanes. This was a moment that could have ended in a quick death or a long, humiliating captivity. For Caesar, it became a stage for a one-act play of his own devising. According to the historian Plutarch, when the pirates demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver, Caesar laughed in their faces. He told them they clearly didn't know who they had captured and insisted that he was worth no less than 50. This was not the plea of a victim. It was the arrogance of a man who never, for a second, relinquished his sense of superiority. For 38 days, he lived among them not as a captive, but as a commander. He composed speeches and poems and recited them to the pirates, calling them illiterate barbarians when they failed to show proper appreciation. He joined in their games, and all the while, he joked with them, telling them that once he was free, he would return and have every last one of them crucified. The pirates, amused by his audacity, treated his threats as a jest. They had profoundly misjudged their man. Once the ransom was paid and he was released, Caesar did not sail for home. He immediately went to the nearest port, raised a small naval force, and set out in pursuit of his former captors. He found them still camped on the same island, utterly unprepared. He captured them, recovered his 50 talents of ransom, and then fulfilled his promise to the letter. He had them crucified. This single episode is a perfect miniature of the Caesar to come. The supreme self-confidence, the ability to charm and dominate even his enemies, the meticulous planning, and the absolute, chilling ruthlessness in retribution. It showed the world that his word, whether a promise or a threat, was his bond, and that beneath the charming, urbane exterior lay a will of tempered steel. What drove this man? What was the inner demon that propelled him from the fringes of the aristocracy to the pinnacle of world power? It was not simply a lust for wealth, though he was perpetually and staggerably in debt. It was not merely a desire for power, though he would accumulate more of it than any Roman before him. The engine at the core of Caesar's being can be summarized in a single, untranslatable Latin word: dignitas. This concept, far more than its English cognate dignity, encompassed a Roman aristocrat's standing, his prestige, his honor, his public worth, and his right to be treated with the respect due to his status and achievements. For Caesar, his dignitas was everything, and he felt it was constantly under assault. He was born into a family with a divine lineage, but a tarnished recent history. He saw lesser men from families like the Metelli or the Cornelii, wielding the power and influence that he believed was his birthright. This sense of grievance was magnified by his financial situation. To compete in Roman politics required a fortune, which he did not have. So he borrowed on a scale that was breathtakingly reckless, spending lavishly on public games to win the favor of the people and on bribes to secure political office. By the time he was in his 30s, his debts were so colossal that they would have crushed any ordinary man. But Caesar was not an ordinary man. He understood that the only way to pay his debts was to acquire more power, which would give him access to the wealth of the provinces. Power was not the end goal. It was the necessary means to service his debts, and more importantly, to achieve the preeminent dignitas he craved. This created a relentless forward momentum. He could never stop, could never rest on his laurels, because to do so meant financial and political ruin. He was like a shark that had to keep swimming to stay alive. This inner demon, this insatiable hunger for validation and status, explains both his greatest strengths and his fatal flaw. It drove him to acts of incredible genius and audacity, but it also made him incapable of compromise. When the Senate later gave him the choice between relinquishing his command and being declared an enemy of the state, they were, in his mind, threatening his dignitas. For a man like Caesar, a life without that preeminent status was not a life worth living. He would rather plunge the world into civil war than suffer the humiliation of being reduced to a private citizen at the mercy of his enemies. The Roman Republic was a machine designed to prevent any one man from accumulating too much power. Its system of annually elected magistrates, of two consuls who could veto each other, and of a powerful Senate, was a complex web of checks and balances. By the 60s BC, this machine had ground to a halt, choked by corruption and the selfish ambitions of powerful oligarchs. Into this paralysis stepped three men who decided that if the system would not serve their ambitions, they would simply go around it. This was the birth of the First Triumvirate, a secret political alliance that was, in effect, a conspiracy to seize control of the Roman state. It was not a friendship. It was a marriage of convenience between three vastly different but equally ambitious men. The first was Gnaeus Pompeius, known as Pompey the Great. He was the most celebrated general of his age, the conqueror of the East, the man who had defeated Mithridates and pacified vast new territories for Rome. He returned to the city, expecting adulation and swift ratification of his political settlements in the East. Instead, he was met with suspicion and obstruction by a jealous Senate that feared his immense popularity and power. Pompey, the military titan, found himself politically impotent. The second was Marcus Licinius Crassus, reputed to be the richest man in Rome. His fortune, built on speculation and exploiting the victims of Sulla's prescriptions, was legendary. Yet, he craved something his money could not buy: the military glory and prestige that Pompey possessed. He represented the immense power of Roman capital, a force as potent as any legion. The third man was Caesar. At this point, he was the junior partner, a rising politician known for his popular appeal and his scandalous debts. What he brought to the alliance was a brilliant political mind, a deep connection with the urban plebs, and a complete lack of scruples about shredding constitutional norms to get what he wanted. The pact was sealed by a political marriage. Pompey married Caesar's only daughter, the beautiful and beloved Julia. Their goal was simple: to use their combined influence, Pompey's soldiers, Crassus's money, and Caesar's political skill, to force their collective will upon the state. They would ensure Caesar was elected consul, and in return, he would push through the legislation that the other two desired. It was a private agreement that effectively privatized the Roman state, a dagger aimed at the heart of the Republic. This fateful alliance gave Caesar the one thing he needed to escape his debts and build a foundation for his dignitas: a major provincial command where he could wage war, win glory, and acquire the fortune necessary to compete at the highest level. The consulship of 59 BC was the first payment on the triumvirate's investment, and it was a year that shook the Roman Republic to its foundations. With the backing of Pompey's veterans, who flooded the city, and Crassus's immense wealth, Caesar operated not as a chief magistrate of the Republic, but as a political battering ram. His co-consul, a staunch optimate named Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, was a man of principle but little power. When Bibulus and other senators, like the famously intransigent Cato the Younger, attempted to obstruct Caesar's legislative agenda, primarily a bill to distribute land to Pompey's veterans, Caesar abandoned all pretense of constitutional procedure. He took his bills directly to the popular assemblies, bypassing the Senate entirely. When Bibulus tried to declare the omens unfavorable, a traditional form of religious veto, he was assaulted in the forum, had a bucket of excrement dumped over his head, and was driven back into his house, where he remained for the rest of the year, effectively under house arrest. From his home, Bibulus issued edicts declaring Caesar's laws invalid, but it was a futile gesture. Caesar simply ignored him, ruling as a sole consul in all but name. Romans wryly joked that the consuls for the year were not Caesar and Bibulus, but Julius and Caesar. This year of intimidation and constitutional vandalism achieved its aims. Pompey's eastern settlements were ratified. Crassus received favorable terms for the tax farmers who were his clients. And Caesar secured for himself the ultimate prize: a 5-year command as proconsul of Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum, along with an army of 4 legions. This was not a typical provincial command. It was a kingdom in waiting. It gave him a legal power base far from the prying eyes of the Senate, an army that would become his personal instrument, and a theater of operations where he could wage war, win unimaginable glory, and plunder enough wealth to finally settle his debts and dwarf his rivals. But the price of this power was the creation of a host of mortal enemies in the Senate, who would never forgive his humiliation of their class and his contempt for the Republic's most sacred traditions. They would wait, patiently, for the day his command expired, when he would be a private citizen once more, and they could finally bring him to justice. Caesar knew this, and he knew his only path forward was to achieve a victory so spectacular that it would make him untouchable. The primary antagonist Caesar faced during the next decade was not a person, but a place, a civilization, a vast and terrifying landscape the Romans called Gallia, Gaul. This was not a unified kingdom, but a chaotic, vibrant, and violent world, a patchwork quilt of hundreds of distinct Celtic and Germanic tribes stretching from the Alps to the Atlantic Ocean. To the Roman mind, it was a green hell, a land of endless dark forests, treacherous swamps, and warrior peoples who lived for battle and were led by fierce, mustachioed chieftains and druidic priests who practiced human sacrifice. This was the macro-level threat, a source of existential fear for Rome ever since the Gauls had sacked the city itself 3 centuries earlier. Caesar's official mandate was to protect the existing Roman province of Transalpine Gaul, modern Provence, and defend Rome's allies. But Caesar, driven by his need for wealth and glory, saw Gaul not as a threat to be contained, but as an opportunity to be exploited. He used the migration of the Helvetii tribe as a pretext to launch a full-scale war of conquest that would last for nearly a decade. This was his great gamble. He was massively outnumbered, operating far from his supply lines in a hostile and unfamiliar environment. The Gallic warriors were brave and formidable opponents, masters of ambush and cavalry warfare. What they lacked was unity. Caesar's entire strategy was a masterclass in divide and conquer. He pitted tribe against tribe, exploiting ancient rivalries, supporting weaker tribes against stronger ones, and then turning on his erstwhile allies. He fought a war of relentless, brutal efficiency, marked by incredible feats of engineering, like his famous bridge over the Rhine, and acts of shocking cruelty, like the extermination of the Usipetes and Tencteri, a massacre of women and children that horrified even the cynical Roman Senate. Gaul became the forge for both his army and his legend. The 4 legions he started with swelled to 10, a hardened, professional fighting force whose loyalty was not to the distant Senate, but to the general who led them to victory after victory, who shared their hardships and who made them rich with plunder. It was in the forests of Gaul that Caesar the politician died, and Caesar, the warlord, was born. He was creating a private army, an instrument of power that would ultimately allow him to challenge the state itself. Even for a man whom Plutarch claimed was blessed by Fortuna, the Gallic campaign was not an unbroken string of victories. There were moments of near disaster, critical junctures where the entire enterprise, and Caesar's life with it, hung by the slenderest of threads. One such moment came during the siege of Gergovia in 52 BC, the capital of the Arverni tribe, led by his most brilliant adversary, Vercingetorix. Here, Caesar's customary boldness tipped over into overconfidence. Underestimating the strength of the Gallic position, he ordered a direct assault that was repulsed with heavy losses. For the first time, his legions were comprehensively beaten, forced into a humiliating retreat, leaving behind 46 of their centurions, the backbone of the Roman army. This was more than a tactical defeat. It was a profound psychological blow. It shattered his aura of invincibility, both for his own men and for the Gauls, who were inspired to rise up in a general revolt that united the tribes against him as never before. In the wake of this failure, Caesar was forced into a period of deep introspection. He had to confront his own fallibility. He understood, perhaps more clearly than ever, that courage and genius were not enough. Fortuna, the goddess of luck, could abandon him at any moment. This psychological breaking point taught him a crucial lesson that would define his later career. When the stakes are absolute, mercy is a luxury, and ruthlessness is a virtue. He realized that to subdue Gaul, he could not just defeat its warriors in battle. He had to break their will to resist. The humiliation at Gergovia directly led to the climactic strategy at Alesia, where he would no longer rely on a simple assault, but would employ a strategy of such monumental scale and cruelty, a total war of starvation and annihilation, that it would permanently extinguish the flame of Gallic independence. This pattern would repeat itself throughout his life. A setback, a moment of failure, did not break him. Instead, it forced him to recalibrate, to escalate his methods, and to return with a more focused and more terrifying determination. He learned from Gergovia that in the great game for survival, the only unforgivable mistake is the one from which you do not learn. While Caesar was forging his army and his legend in the crucible of Gaul, the political landscape in Rome was undergoing a seismic shift. The first triumvirate, the three-legged stool that had supported his rise, was beginning to splinter and collapse, not from external pressure, but from its own internal contradictions. The first leg to break was Crassus. Driven by his desperate need for military glory to rival Pompey's, he led an army of 7 legions into the deserts of Mesopotamia to conquer the Parthian Empire. It was an act of supreme hubris, and it ended in one of the most catastrophic defeats in Roman history. At the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BC, the Roman legions, slow and ponderous, were annihilated by the swift horse archers of the Parthians. Crassus himself was captured and, according to legend, executed by having molten gold poured down his throat, a grimly symbolic end for the richest man in Rome. His death removed the financial ballast of the triumvirate and, more importantly, the buffer between the two remaining titans, Caesar and Pompey. The second blow to the alliance was more personal and perhaps more profound. In 54 BC, Caesar's beloved daughter Julia, Pompey's wife, died in childbirth. She had been the human link, the emotional glue that held the political pact together. Her death severed the last familial bond between the two men. With Crassus and Julia gone, the rivalry between Caesar and Pompey, long simmering beneath the surface, was now exposed. Pompey, remaining in Rome, grew increasingly wary of his father-in-law's spectacular successes in Gaul. He began to drift back into the embrace of the Optimates, the conservative faction in the Senate led by Cato, who saw Pompey as the only man powerful enough to check Caesar's ambition. This created the perfect storm of opportunity from chaos. The very breakdown of the political order in Rome, which descended into mob violence, created a power vacuum that Pompey was appointed to fill as sole consul. This alliance between Pompey and the Senate forged the two sides of the coming civil war. Caesar, watching from Gaul, understood the situation perfectly. His enemies were now consolidated. but they had also revealed their hand. The chaos in Rome provided him with the perfect justification for retaining his command and his army. He was no longer just a general. He was a political faction, a state within a state, waiting for the moment when the crumbling republic would finally force a confrontation. The culmination of Caesar's Gallic Wars and the greatest triumph of his military career was not a pitched battle in an open field, but a monumental feat of engineering and siegecraft at a place called Alesia in 52 BC. Following the disaster at Gergovia, nearly all of Gaul had risen in a unified rebellion under the charismatic leadership of Vercingetorix. He had gathered a massive army, perhaps as many as 80,000 warriors, and taken refuge in the hill fortress of Alesia, a position deemed impregnable. He intended to wait Caesar out, forcing the Romans to either starve or retreat. What he had not counted on was the sheer, terrifying audacity of Caesar's response. Instead of retreating, Caesar laid siege to the entire mountain. His legions, working day and night, constructed an 11-mile-long ring of fortifications around Alesia, complete with trenches, walls, watchtowers, and fields of deadly man-traps. It was a masterpiece of military engineering, designed to keep Vercingetorix's army in, but Caesar knew that a massive Gallic relief army, reportedly numbering over 200,000, was on its way. So he ordered his men to build a second, even larger ring of fortifications facing outwards. This outer wall, nearly 14 miles long, was designed to keep the relief army out. Caesar had effectively besieged his enemies, while simultaneously turning his own army into a besieged garrison, trapped between two hostile forces. The sensory experience of this event must have been apocalyptic. The constant sound of hammers and saws, the smell of fresh-cut earth and timber, the sight of two vast armies arrayed against one small Roman force. When the relief army finally arrived, the battle that ensued was one of the most complex in ancient history. The Romans were attacked from both sides at once, fighting desperately on two fronts. It was a scene of unimaginable chaos and carnage. Caesar himself rode along the lines, his crimson cloak a beacon in the madness, urging his men on, his presence turning the tide at the critical moment. In the end, Roman discipline and engineering triumphed over Gallic numbers and ferocity. The relief army was broken and scattered. Vercingetorix, watching from the walls of Alesia as his last hope was extinguished, was forced to surrender. This was more than a victory. It was the annihilation of a nation's hope, a triumph so complete and so spectacular that it elevated Caesar to a status verging on the divine. At the very moment of his greatest military triumph, as Vercingetorix laid his arms at his feet, Caesar was already fighting another, more subtle war, a war for public opinion, a battle for the narrative. While his legions were building walls and fighting battles, Caesar was building his own myth, using one of the most powerful weapons ever devised, the written word. It was during the lulls in the fighting, in the cold nights of his winter quarters, that he composed his Commentari de Bello Gallico, Commentaries on the Gallic War. This was not a simple memoir. It was a masterpiece of political propaganda, disguised as a dry, objective military report. Written in a spare, direct, and powerful Latin, it presented a carefully curated version of events designed for one specific audience: the Senate and people of Rome. In its pages, Caesar is never the aggressor. He is always responding to threats, protecting Roman allies, or acting in the best interests of the state. He portrays himself not as an ambitious conqueror, but as a patient, dutiful, and reluctant servant of the Republic. He is always calm in a crisis, brilliant in his strategy, and merciful in victory, unless, of course, the Gaul's treachery forces him to be severe. He carefully omits his own blunders, downplays his losses, and magnifies his successes. The psychology of this act is revealing. At the height of his power, surrounded by his loyal legions, Caesar still felt the need to justify himself, to win the argument. He understood that military victory alone was not enough. To secure his position, he had to control how that victory was perceived. He was becoming the author of his own epic, casting himself as the hero in a grand saga of civilization against barbarism. This moment of supreme hubris, where he believed he could shape not only the events of the present, but also the memory of the future, marks a crucial turning point. He was no longer just a Roman general. He was a force of history, a man who saw himself as operating on a plane above ordinary mortals. The commentaries were his testimony, his defense, and his declaration of intent. They sent a clear message back to his enemies in Rome. I am not just a conqueror. I am the indispensable man, the savior of Rome, and you challenge me at your peril. As Caesar's star ascended, so too did the stature of his sworn enemy, the man who would become the reluctant champion of the senatorial elite, Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. The personal drama between these two men is one of the great tragedies of Roman history. They were not natural enemies. For years, they were allies, bound by political necessity and the marriage of Pompey to Caesar's daughter, Julia. Pompey was a generation older, a man who had been the prodigy of Roman politics, granted a triumph before he was legally old enough to be a senator. He was Magnus the Great, Rome's most accomplished general before Caesar's rise. His career was a catalogue of success. He had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates, conquered the East, and brought immense wealth into the Roman treasury. Yet, his personality was the inverse of Caesar's. Where Caesar was audacious, charming, and decisive, Pompey was often hesitant, vain, and politically naive. He craved the approval of the traditional aristocracy, the very men who had always looked down on him as a brutish but useful tool. The chemistry of their relationship was a complex mix of respect, rivalry, and affection. Pompey was genuinely fond of Julia, and her death shattered the personal link to Caesar. As Caesar's victories in Gaul grew more and more spectacular, Pompey's own considerable achievements began to seem like ancient history. Jealousy, the great acid of Roman politics, began to corrode their relationship. The Optimates, led by the morally rigid and fanatically anti-Caesarian Cato the Younger, masterfully exploited this insecurity. They flattered Pompey, showered him with honors, and convinced him that he alone could save the Republic from the aspiring tyrant in Gaul. He became their champion, not out of a deep-seated conviction for Republican principles, but out of a desperate need to maintain his position as Rome's preeminent citizen, his dignitas. The struggle was thus not merely between two political factions, but between two titans whose egos could no longer inhabit the same city. Pompey saw Caesar as a dangerous radical who threatened the established order that had given him his status. Caesar saw Pompey as a hypocrite, a man who had bent the rules for his own benefit, but now piously defended them to thwart his rival. It was a collision course, a personal and political drama destined to be resolved not in the Senate, but on the battlefield. While Caesar is remembered primarily as a conqueror, to see him only as a man of war is to miss half the picture. He was also a radical political and social reformer, a man with a clear vision for the Roman state, a vision that put him in direct conflict with the conservative Senate. His reforms were a brilliant blend of genuine statesmanship and shrewd political calculation, designed to solve real problems while simultaneously binding key constituencies to his cause with unbreakable bonds of loyalty. During his consulship and later during his dictatorship, he enacted a sweeping populist agenda. First, he tackled the problem of land distribution, a festering issue for over a century. He enacted laws that gave farmland in Italy and the provinces to tens of thousands of his discharged veterans, and to the urban poor of Rome. This was not just an act of social welfare. It created a vast new class of property owners whose prosperity depended entirely on the survival of Caesar's legislation, and thus on Caesar himself. He addressed the chronic instability of the grain supply to Rome, the infamous bread and circuses, by reforming the system and ensuring a stable, subsidized supply, a move that made him a hero to the plebeian masses. Perhaps his most lasting reform was the one that still shapes our daily lives, the reform of the calendar. The old Roman calendar was a chaotic lunar system that had drifted so far out of sync with the seasons that public festivals were being celebrated at the wrong time of year. With the help of Alexandrian astronomers, Caesar introduced a new solar calendar of 365 1/4 days, the Julian calendar. It was a monumental feat of scientific administration that brought order and predictability to the civic and religious life of the empire. Each of these reforms, while beneficial to the state, was also a political weapon. They demonstrated his superior competence compared to the paralyzed Senate and built a broad coalition of support, veterans, the urban poor, provincial elites, that transcended the traditional power structures of Rome. He was, in effect, building a new state around himself, piece by piece, winning the loyalty of the people by giving them the things the old aristocracy would not. The narrative of Caesar's life would be incomplete without understanding the profound influence of one woman and the civilization she represented. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt. Their relationship, immortalized in literature and legend, was far more than a torrid love affair. It was a meeting of two worlds and two different conceptions of power. After defeating Pompey at Pharsalus, Caesar pursued his rival to Egypt, only to be presented with Pompey's severed head. He found himself embroiled in a dynastic struggle for the Egyptian throne between the young Cleopatra and her brother. The famous story of her smuggling herself into his presence, wrapped in a carpet, is a testament to her audacity, a quality Caesar would have immediately recognized and admired. For Caesar, a Roman aristocrat from a republic that was founded on the rejection of kings, Cleopatra was a revelation. She was not merely a queen, she was a living goddess, the inheritor of a 3,000-year-old tradition of absolute, divine monarchy. In Egypt, power was not a temporary office granted by the people. It was a sacred, hereditary right, embodied in a single person. He saw firsthand a state that was centralized, efficient, and fabulously wealthy, administered by a ruler who was an object of religious worship. This experience undeniably planted a seed in Caesar's mind. It showed him an alternative to the chaotic, faction-ridden mess of the Roman Republic. His affair with Cleopatra, which produced a son, Caesarion, was a personal indulgence, but also a political statement. He brought her back to Rome and installed her in a villa across the Tiber, scandalizing the conservative elite. He even placed a golden statue of her in the temple of Venus Genetrix, his divine ancestress, publicly linking his lineage with that of this foreign, absolute monarch. For his enemies, this was the ultimate proof of his tyrannical ambitions. They whispered that he planned to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Alexandria and rule with Cleopatra as a king and queen. While this was likely just propaganda, the allure of the East, of a different, more absolute and elegant model of power, had a profound psychological impact on a man who was already struggling with the institutional constraints of the republic he now dominated. Even at the zenith of his power, as he celebrated an unprecedented 4 triumphs and was showered with honors by a sycophantic Senate, the first cracks in the edifice of his authority began to appear. The air in Rome grew thick with suspicion and resentment. The very totality of his victory was a problem. By eliminating all his rivals, he had become the sole focal point for all the anxieties and hatreds of the Roman elite. The harbingers of the coming storm were everywhere. Scurrilous pamphlets and anonymous graffiti began appearing across the city, denouncing him as a king, Rex, the most toxic political insult in the Roman vocabulary. His affair with Cleopatra and the honors he accorded her were seen as an affront to Roman tradition. His plans for grand new building projects and ambitious military campaigns against Parthia were viewed not as beneficial for the state, but as further evidence of his insatiable personal ambition. The conspiracy against him began to coalesce, not among the remnants of Pompey's faction, many of whom Caesar had pardoned and promoted, but among men who owed their careers to him. The two most prominent leaders were Gaius Cassius Longinus, a talented general who felt he had not been sufficiently rewarded, and Marcus Junius Brutus. Brutus was a special case. He was the son of Caesar's longtime mistress, Servilia, and Caesar treated him with almost paternal affection. But Brutus was also a man steeped in the traditions of the Republic, who traced his own ancestry back to the man who had expelled Rome's last king. He became torn between his personal loyalty to Caesar and his ideological commitment to the abstract ideal of Republican liberty. This group of conspirators, eventually numbering some 60 senators, was led by the implacable moral certainty of men like Cato the Younger, who had committed suicide rather than accept a pardon from Caesar, becoming a martyr for the Republican cause. They saw Caesar's clemency not as a sign of magnanimity, but as the ultimate act of tyranny, the power of one man to grant life or death to his fellow citizens. The political atmosphere became paranoid and poisonous. Every move Caesar made was interpreted in the most sinister light. The very power he had accumulated to protect himself had now made him the ultimate target. He had climbed so high that the only way down was to fall. The single act that made civil war inevitable was both strategically brilliant and politically catastrophic. It was a single decision, a point of no return, the crossing of a small river in northern Italy called the Rubicon. By early 49 BC, Caesar's command in Gaul was set to expire. His enemies in the Senate, led by his former ally Pompey, had engineered a situation where he would have to give up his army and his province before he could stand for election as consul. This would leave a gap of several months during which he would be a private citizen, stripped of his legal immunity. In that time, they would undoubtedly prosecute him for his actions during his first consulship a decade earlier. Conviction was a certainty, and the penalty would be exile or even death. For Caesar, this was an existential threat, a direct assault on his dignitas. He had two choices: submit to his enemies and face certain political destruction, or resist. He chose to resist. He led one of his legions, the 13th, to the banks of the Rubicon, the legal boundary between his province and Italy proper. To cross it with an army was an act of treason, a declaration of war against the state. The psychology of this moment, as reported by ancient historians, was one of profound anguish and hesitation. He reportedly stood before the river for hours, weighing the immense consequences of his actions, knowing that this step would plunge the Roman world into a fratricidal war. This was not the impulsive act of a hot-headed rebel. It was the cold, calculated decision of a man who had exhausted all other options. He had concluded that the personal risk of fighting a civil war was less than the certain ruin of surrendering to his political foes. The famous phrase he is said to have uttered, "Alea iacta est," the die is cast, was not a cry of triumph, but a fatalistic acceptance of the path he had chosen. He was gambling everything, his life, his reputation, the fate of Rome itself, on a single roll of the dice. In crossing that small stream, he was crossing a legal and psychological threshold. He was no longer a servant of the Republic, but its master or its destroyer. There could be no turning back. The great tragedy of the Roman Civil War was not that it happened, but that it pitted Roman against Roman, legion against legion. The climax of this fratricidal conflict was not a glorious victory against a foreign foe, but a grim and bloody affair on a dusty plain in northern Greece called Pharsalus. This was the greatest moral and political catastrophe of Caesar's life. On one side stood Caesar, with his hardened veteran legions from Gaul, outnumbered but superior in experience and morale. On the other side stood Pompey the Great, commanding a larger army that included the flower of the Roman Senate, hundreds of aristocrats who believed they were fighting to preserve the Republic. For Caesar, victory was a strategic necessity, but it was also a source of profound sorrow. These were not Gauls or Germans. They were his own countrymen, men with whom he had served and dined. The battle itself was a tactical masterpiece. Caesar, seeing that Pompey's great advantage was in his cavalry, created a hidden fourth line of infantry armed with spears, instructing them not to throw them, but to use them as pikes, thrusting at the faces of the aristocratic Roman horsemen. The tactic worked perfectly. Pompey's cavalry, confident of victory, was routed, and Caesar's legions overwhelmed the enemy infantry. The slaughter was immense, but the defining moment came after the battle. As Caesar rode across the battlefield, he saw not the spoils of a great victory, but the bodies of his fallen enemies, consuls, senators, patricians, the ruling class of Rome, lying dead in their fine armor. It was at this moment that he is said to have uttered the haunting words, "They would have it so." It was not a boast, but a lament, a recognition of the terrible price of his ambition and their intransigence. He had won the war, but in doing so, he had effectively destroyed the very class that had governed Rome for centuries. Pharsalus was the death knell of the old republic. It proved that political disputes would now be settled not by votes in the Senate, but by the sword. After the battle, Caesar famously pardoned many of the high-ranking enemies he captured, including Marcus Brutus. But this act of clemency could not erase the stain of the catastrophe. He was now the undisputed master of the Roman world, but his mastery was built on the corpses of his fellow citizens, a foundation of blood and guilt that would haunt him for the rest of his life. In the aftermath of the Civil War, Caesar returned to Rome not as a conquering general, but as an unsolvable political problem. He had all the power, but the state he now controlled was still, in name and theory, a republic. This led to the final, fatal collapse of republican norms, as Caesar and a subservient Senate tried to find a constitutional framework for a power that was fundamentally unconstitutional. The result was a desperate and ultimately self-defeating accumulation of titles and honors that served only to highlight the paradox of his position. He was made dictator, first for a year, then for 10 years, and finally, in early 44 BC, dictator perpetuo, dictator for life. This was a terrifying innovation. The dictatorship had been an ancient emergency office, but it was always temporary. A permanent dictatorship was simply monarchy by another name. He was granted the title of imperator, commander, not as a temporary honor after a victory, but as a permanent part of his name. His face, for the first time in Roman history, was placed on coins, a practice associated with the Hellenistic kings of the East, not the magistrates of a free republic. His statue was placed among the statues of the kings of old on the Capitoline Hill. He was granted the right to wear the triumphal purple toga on all public occasions. He was, in effect, a king in all but name, and he seemed to revel in the ambiguity. He would refuse the formal title of Rex, as he did in the famous Lupercalia scene when Mark Antony offered him a diadem, but he simultaneously accepted honors that were monarchical in all but name. This attempt to rule a republic as a king without a crown created an intolerable tension. For the remaining traditionalists in the Senate, it was a daily humiliation. They were forced to vote him ever more extravagant honors while knowing their own power was gone. Caesar's clemency, his refusal to enact prescriptions like Sulla, paradoxically made the situation worse. By allowing his enemies to live and even serve in his government, he created a space for conspiracy to fester. He failed to solve the fundamental problem, how to institutionalize his power without destroying the republican ideal that still commanded the loyalty of the Roman elite. The result was a political dead end, a situation where he held all the power but no legitimate, sustainable way to exercise it. His omnipotence had made him a prisoner, isolated at the summit of a state that no longer knew what it was. The final scene of Caesar's life was a masterpiece of tragic irony, a bloody drama played out in the very heart of the city he had conquered. The Ides of March, the 15th of the month, 44 BC. The circumstances of his death brought his entire story full circle. The Senate was meeting not in its traditional house, which had been burned down in riots, but in the Curia attached to the Theater of Pompey, a grand complex built and paid for by his great rival. Caesar, who had ignored multiple warnings, including a dream from his wife Calpurnia and a note from a soothsayer, proceeded to the meeting. He was a man who had survived countless battles, who had faced down entire armies, yet he walked into a room of unarmed men who were his friends, his beneficiaries, and his pardoned enemies. The assassination itself was a brutal, chaotic affair, not a clean execution, but a frenzied stabbing by some 60 men, many of whom wounded each other in their desperate haste. It was a ritual sacrifice as much as a political act. The conspirators called themselves the Liberatores, the Liberators, and they believed that by killing the man, they could kill the tyranny and restore the Republic. They were fatally naive. Their ultimate act of irony and of poetic justice was that Caesar, staggering from 23 stab wounds, fell and died at the base of the great statue of Pompey the Great. The man who had defeated Pompey, pardoned his followers, and dominated the world died at the feet of his vanquished foe, his blood pooling on the cold marble. The great victor was, in his final moment, laid low at the monument of the man he had vanquished. But the conspirators' greatest miscalculation was in believing that Caesar was merely a man. By murdering him, they did not restore the Republic. They unleashed a new and even more terrible wave of civil war. They also martyred their victim. His death, so brutal and treacherous, transformed the flawed, ambitious dictator into a tragic hero in the eyes of the Roman people. By killing the would-be king, they ensured that his heir would become an emperor. The finale was not the restoration of liberty, but the dawn of autocracy. The legacy of Gaius Julius Caesar is a raging, centuries-long conflict of interpretations. For 2 millennia, his ghost has haunted the Western imagination, and the verdict on his life remains as divided as the Roman world he left behind. Was he the ultimate tyrant, a man of boundless ambition, whose ego was so vast that he destroyed a 500-year-old republic for his own personal glory? Or was he the savior of Rome, a pragmatic and far-sighted statesman who recognized that the old republic was already dead and was simply performing a necessary, if painful, mercy-killing? This is the central conflict. For his detractors, both ancient and modern, he is the archetypal demagogue. They point to his illegal wars, his subversion of the Constitution, his populist pandering, and his ultimate acceptance of autocratic power as proof that he was a destroyer of liberty. In this view, men like Cato and Brutus are the true heroes, martyrs to the cause of freedom against a charismatic despot. Dante, in his Inferno, famously placed Brutus and Cassius in the lowest circle of hell, gnawed for eternity by Satan himself, for the ultimate sin of treachery against their master. This view sees Caesar's life as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the fragility of democratic institutions. Yet, for his admirers, Caesar was a progressive force, a man who swept away a corrupt and decadent oligarchy that was incapable of governing a vast empire. They argue that the Republic was already a fiction, a playground for wealthy senators who exploited the provinces and ignored the needs of the people. In this interpretation, Caesar's reforms, his extension of citizenship, his mercy towards his enemies, and his vision for a more integrated and efficiently governed empire mark him as a visionary leader. His name itself became the template for a new kind of ruler. In Russia, he was the Tsar. In Germany, he was the Kaiser. His legacy is thus profoundly ambiguous. He is both the model for the enlightened autocrat, the Napoleonic figure who brings order out of chaos, and the villain in a morality play about the death of freedom. He remains a mirror in which subsequent ages have seen their own political hopes and fears reflected. A man so colossal that his shadow creates a space for endless debate about the eternal struggle between liberty and order, the individual and the state. So we return to the central dramatic paradox. How did a man with no crown, a politician in a republic that defined itself by its hatred of kings, become the eternal symbol of absolute power? The final, comprehensive answer lies in the very nature of his revolution. He succeeded because he never formally tried to become king. By carefully maintaining the outward forms of the republic, the Senate, the consuls, the assemblies, while systematically draining them of all real power and concentrating it in himself, he created an entirely new blueprint for autocracy. He showed that you did not need a crown if you controlled the legions. You did not need the title of king if you controlled the treasury and the distribution of grain. You did not need a throne if the people hailed you as a demigod and the father of your country. Caesar's genius was to understand that the source of power was no longer located in the traditional institutions of the Republic, but in the loyalty of the army and the adoration of the masses. He bypassed the Senate and drew his legitimacy directly from the people and the soldiers. The titles he accepted, Dictator Perpetuo, Imperator, were republican in origin, but he stretched their meaning to the breaking point, transforming them into the components of a de facto monarchy. His heir and grandnephew, Octavian, who would become Augustus, learned this lesson perfectly. Augustus would piously claim to have restored the Republic, all while holding the real power as princeps, or first citizen. He perfected the model that Caesar invented, the autocrat who rules from behind the facade of republican institutions. This is the solution to the paradox. Caesar became the symbol of power, not in spite of the fact that he had no crown, but because of it. He demonstrated that the old symbols were irrelevant. He uncoupled the reality of power from its traditional titles, and in doing so, created a more durable and insidious form of one-man rule. The assassins who stabbed him to death thought they were killing a king, but they were wrong. They were killing a man who had made kings obsolete, who had shown that absolute power could wear a toga and call itself a consul. That was his true and most enduring revolution. The final verdict of history on Gaius Julius Caesar is that his life represents the universal and tragic lesson of how great historical transformations occur. He teaches us that epochs do not end and begin based on abstract, impersonal forces alone. They are driven over the precipice by the sheer, world-altering will of singular individuals who embody the contradictions, the genius, and the pathologies of their age. Caesar did not, in a single-handed act of malevolence, murder the Roman Republic. The Republic had been ailing for a century, racked by the cancer of corruption, extreme inequality, and political violence. It was a system designed for a city-state that had proven utterly incapable of managing a global empire. Caesar was not the disease that killed the Republic. He was a symptom of its terminal illness, the brilliant and ruthless surgeon who finally signed the death certificate. His story is a testament to the idea that in times of systemic collapse, the political vacuum will inevitably be filled by a man of immense ambition and talent who offers a simple, decisive solution: order at the price of liberty. He shows that when institutions fail, power flows to the man who can command loyalty through a combination of fear, charisma, and patronage. His life was a struggle not just against Pompey or the Senate, but against the very structure of the Roman world and, in a sense, against fate itself. He was a gambler who constantly raised the stakes, believing in his own destiny, his own fortuna, until the final roll of the dice on the Ides of March. The ultimate lesson of his saga is a deeply unsettling one, that sometimes history presents a choice not between good and evil, but between a chaotic, dysfunctional freedom and an efficient, ordered tyranny. Caesar's tragedy, and Rome's, was that he made tyranny seem like the only rational choice. The final frame of this epic saga is not one of blood on a marble floor, but of fire in the night sky. In the summer following his assassination, during the funeral games held in his honor by his heir, Octavian, a brilliant comet appeared and blazed across the heavens for 7 consecutive days. In a world steeped in portents and omens, the meaning was unmistakable. For the common people of Rome, who had just witnessed his public funeral, where a wax effigy of his mutilated body was displayed, this was no mere astronomical event. It was the Sidus Iulium, the Julian star. It was the soul of the murdered dictator, Gaius Julius Caesar, ascending to the heavens to take his place among the gods, as his divine ancestress, Venus, had done before him. The Senate, now cowed by the fury of the people and the power of Caesar's veterans, was forced to officially recognize his divinity. He became Divus Iulius, the divine Julius. This was his ultimate posthumous triumph. The man they had killed for wanting to be a king had, in death, become a god. His name, Caesar, ceased to be a mere family cognomen and transformed into a title, a synonym for power itself, a word that would echo through the centuries on the lips of emperors and czars. The shadow cast by that comet, by that deified man, would loom over all of Western civilization, a perpetual reminder that a man can be killed, but an idea, an ambition, a name can become immortal.